Open any history book, and you will see the names of emperors, generals, and presidents. They are the faces we are taught to remember. But if you want to understand how the world actually works, you have to look at the shadows behind the throne. There is a level of wealth that is so vast, it becomes invisible. A power so absolute, it doesn't need a crown or a seat at the United Nations. For over 2 centuries, a single name has been whispered in the corridors of every central bank and every war room in history: the Rothschilds. While the world was distracted by the rise and fall of empires, this family was quietly building a global nervous system made of gold and debt. They didn't just survive the 19th century, they owned it. From the streets of a dark Frankfurt ghetto to the gilded halls of London and Paris, they mastered a game that no one else even knew was being played. They realized that the true currency of power isn't land or soldiers, it is information and interest. Every tax you pay today, every digital dollar that loses value while you sleep, is part of a financial architecture they designed. This is not just history. This is the manual for the world you live in. Welcome to Chronicles of Capital. Today, we step behind the curtain. The archive is open. We are led to believe that we live in a world of open competition and free markets. We are told that the economy is a natural force, like the weather, governed by the invisible hand of supply and demand. But what if that hand isn't invisible? What if it's been reaching out from a single boardroom for over 2 centuries? The greatest trick the financial elite ever pulled was convincing the world that money is a public utility managed for the benefit of the people. In reality, the global financial system is a highly orchestrated theater. Every stock market crash, every sudden surge in inflation, and every national bankruptcy is often just a scene in a much larger play. The Rothschilds understood a fundamental truth long before anyone else. To control a nation, you don't need to wear a crown or lead an army. You simply need to be the one who issues its debt. While the public focuses on presidents and prime ministers, the real power lies with the creditors. By positioning themselves as the ultimate lenders to the world's most powerful empires, they created a reality where governments no longer worked for their citizens, but for their interest payments. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a business model, a model that relies on your belief that the system is too complex to understand. They want you to stay distracted by the noise of politics while they manage the silence of the ledger. They built an illusion of choice, while they own the very floor the game is played on. To see how they constructed this cage, we have to travel back to where the first bricks were laid, to a time when a small family from Frankfurt decided to become the bankers of the world. The year is 1760. The location is the Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt. A narrow, dark street packed with houses that were never meant to hold the weight of the dreams being born inside them. In a house marked by a red shield, a Rothschild, Mayor Amschel lived a life dictated by the harsh restrictions of his time. He was a dealer in rare coins and curiosities, a man who spent his days handling the physical remnants of fallen empires. But while others saw old metal, Mayer saw a pattern. He realized that the wealth of individuals was fleeting, but the hunger of states was eternal. Kings and princes were always at war, and war was the most expensive habit in human history. To fund their ambitions, they didn't just need money, they needed a system that could manufacture it out of thin air. Mayer began to position himself not just as a merchant, but as a trusted handler of the finances for the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest men in Europe. But Mayer's true genius wasn't just in how he handled money, it was in how he handled his bloodline. He had 5 sons: Amschel, Solomon, Nathan, Karl, and James. He didn't want them to be heirs to a shop. He wanted them to be the pillars of a new world order. He treated them like 5 arrows bound together in a single quiver, impossible to break as long as they remained united. Mayer executed a masterstroke of geographical strategy. He sent his 5 sons to the 5 beating hearts of Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. It was the world's first multinational financial corporation. By spreading his family across the continent, Mayer created a private communication network that was faster and more reliable than any government's. They had their own couriers, their own coded language, and their own secret intelligence. While the kings of Europe were waiting for official reports from the front lines, the Rothschild brothers already knew the results of the battles. They knew which banks were about to fail and which currencies were about to rise. They weren't just participating in the market, they were becoming the market. They had built a bridge across the borders of Europe, a bridge made of gold and secrets, and they were about to use it to bring the British Empire to its knees. June 18th, 1815. A small patch of muddy ground in Belgium called Waterloo. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder and the screams of 60,000 dying men. This wasn't just a battle between Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington. It was a gamble on the future of the Western world. If Napoleon won, his French Empire would reshape Europe in his image. If he lost, The British crown would take its place as the undisputed master of the seas. But while the soldiers fought in the mud, the real war was being waged 300 miles away, on the floor of the London Stock Exchange. The city was paralyzed by fear. Everyone knew that the outcome of this battle would determine the value of every British government bond. If the news was bad, the pound would collapse, and fortunes would vanish in an instant. Among the anxious crowd stood Nathan Rothschild. He was the only man in England who wasn't guessing. Through his private network of high-speed couriers and fast ships, Nathan had received word of Napoleon's defeat a full 24 hours before the official government messengers had even left the continent. He possessed the most valuable piece of information in human history, and he was about to use it to execute the greatest financial heist the world had ever seen. Nathan didn't run to the rooftops to announce the victory. He did the opposite. He walked to his usual pillar at the stock exchange, his face a mask of cold indifference, and he began to sell. He dumped his British bonds with a calculated intensity that sent a shockwave through the room. The watchers whispered, "Rothschild knows. Wellington is defeated. The French are coming." Panic turned into a frenzy. Terrified investors, following Nathan's lead, began to sell their own holdings for whatever they could get. The price of British consols plummeted into the dirt. The economy of the world's most powerful empire was being sold for pennies on the dollar. And in the shadows, hidden behind a web of secret agents, Nathan Rothschild was quietly buying it all back. By the time the official news reached London that Napoleon had been crushed, Nathan Rothschild owned the debt of the British government. He had increased his family's wealth by a factor of 2,500 in a single afternoon. He didn't just win a trade, he became the primary creditor of the British Empire. From that day forward, the British crown was no longer sovereign in the way it once was. They owed their existence to a private bank. The arrows Mayor Amschel had sent out were no longer just symbols. They were the invisible chains that bound the fate of nations to the ledger of a single family. The sword had been defeated by the bank, and the era of the debt-driven empire had officially begun. With the British Empire effectively in their pocket, the Rothschilds didn't stop. They realized that the real profit wasn't in peace. It was in the friction between nations. They perfected a strategy that would become the blueprint for modern geopolitics, financing both sides of a conflict. To a king, a war is about glory or territory. To a Rothschild, a war was a massive, high-interest loan that could never truly be repaid. They provided the gold that fueled the machinery of death across Europe. When the French needed to rebuild, the Rothschilds were there. When the Austrians needed to crush a rebellion, the Rothschilds were there. By holding the debt of rival nations, they became the ultimate arbiters of peace. If a government became too defiant, the family could simply tighten the credit lines or fund their neighbor's army. They had turned the battlefield into a balance sheet, where the only guaranteed winner was the House of Rothschild. This wasn't just about making money, it was about making nations dependent. A country in debt is a country that has surrendered its sovereignty. While the public cheered for their generals, the generals were checking their bank balances to see if they could afford another month of gunpowder. The family's influence became so pervasive that it was said no bird could fly over Europe without the Rothschilds' permission. They had created a closed loop of power. They funded the wars, managed the debt that followed, and then financed the reconstruction. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth extraction that moved money from the pockets of the taxpayers directly into the family's vaults. The arrows were now deep in the heart of the global economy. They had proven that the most effective way to rule was not through a visible throne, but through an invisible ledger. And their next move was even more ambitious. They were going to move from financing governments to creating the institutions that controlled the money itself. The true pinnacle of the Rothschild strategy wasn't just lending money, it was controlling the source of it. They understood that as long as a currency was tied to something physical, like gold, there was a limit to how much debt a government could take on. To truly expand their empire, they needed to institutionalize their influence. They became the architects and the primary stakeholders of the early central banking systems across Europe. These weren't public institutions designed to help the common man. They were private entities with public masks. By establishing the concept of a central bank, the Rothschilds and their associates created a mechanism where a private board could decide the interest rates and the money supply of an entire nation. They shifted the power of the purse away from elected officials and into the hands of unelected bankers. This model allowed them to master the art of the boom and bust cycle. By expanding credit, they could create a period of artificial prosperity, encouraging businesses and individuals to take on massive debts. Then, by suddenly contracting the money supply, they could trigger a crash, allowing them to swoop in and buy up real assets, land, factories, and resources for pennies on the dollar. When you hear about the independence of central banks today, you're hearing the echo of the Rothschild legacy. It is a system designed to ensure that no matter who wins the election, the creditors always get paid first. The debt became the very air the global economy breathed. Gold was slowly pushed into the background, replaced by paper promises that were easier to manipulate and infinite in supply. The cage was complete. The world had moved from the rule of law to the rule of the debt issuers, and the common man was left to pay the interest on a debt he never agreed to. As the 20th century dawned, a strange thing happened. The name Rothschild began to fade from the headlines. The massive, overt displays of wealth were replaced by a calculated silence. To the casual observer, it looked like the family's influence had diminished, overtaken by the new industrial titans of America, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and the Carnegies. But those who understand the nature of power know that the most dangerous weapon is the one you cannot see. The Rothschilds didn't lose their power, they institutionalized it. They moved their wealth into a complex web of foundations, trusts, and holding companies that are almost impossible to track. They understood that in an age of rising populism and envy, being the richest person on a Forbes list is a liability. It is far better to own the bank that lends to the billionaire than to be the billionaire yourself. Today, the family's presence is felt in the hushed boardrooms of the world's most powerful financial institutions. They remain masters of the niche, mergers, acquisitions, and sovereign debt. While the world watches the volatility of crypto or the drama of tech stocks, the old money remains anchored in the bedrock of the global system. They are the silent partners in the grand architecture of globalism. They no longer need to shout because they own the microphone. Their legacy isn't found in a single bank account. It is found in the very fact that every major nation on earth is currently drowning in debt to a system they helped create. We have reached a point where the machine is now larger than the men who built it. The debt-driven system has become a self-aware entity that requires constant growth just to survive. It is a mathematical trap with no exit. We are living in the final stages of a cycle that began in that Frankfurt ghetto over 200 years ago. The world's total debt is now so massive that it can never, under any circumstances, be paid back. But the goal was never repayment. The goal was control. As long as you are in debt, your time belongs to the creditor. As long as a nation is in debt, its laws are written by the lenders. We have traded the physical chains of the past for the digital chains of the interest rate. The point of no return isn't a future event. We passed it decades ago. We are now simply living through the consequences of a world that chose the illusion of credit over the reality of value. The history of the Rothschilds is not just a chronicle of wealth. It is a mirror reflecting the evolution of our own servitude. But knowledge is the first step towards sovereignty. Once you see the strings, the puppet master loses his grip. The archive is a tool for those who wish to wake up before the final curtain falls. Protect your mind. Protect your future. The story of capital is still being written, but only the few will choose the ink. Subscribe to Chronicles of Capital and step out of the shadow. The archive is always open.